The vote is the symbol of your equality. Use it, and use it well. With these words, Carrie Chapman Catt signaled the end of a journey that had started in 1848 at Seneca Falls and ended more than a generation later in 1920 in Nashville, Tennessee. She also signaled the beginning of a new journey, the journey of the League of Women Voters. Like the suffrage movement, that journey has spanned generations. Like the suffrage movement, that journey has not always been on a straight path. It has not always been smooth, and it has not always been easy. The women and men who fought for voting rights for women were committed to the belief in the power of women to create a more perfect democracy. They understood that the vote is the symbol of equality in American democracy. The Constitution begins with the words, "We the people of the United States." The central struggles of our history arise out of defining who is included in we the people. But there is one thing that is absolutely certain, is that we the people only includes those with the right to vote. If you don't vote, you don't count. And if you can't vote, you can't be counted. When Elisabeth Cady Stanton issued her Declaration of Sentiments to the Seneca Falls Assembly, she and those who agreed with her started a journey. They did not know when or how the journey would end, but they had a plan. For the remainder of the century, led by Susan B. Anthony, they pursued that plan. And in 1900, it was time for a new generation to assume leadership and carry on the fight until it was finished. Carrie Chapman Catt was not Susan B. Anthony's favorite choice for successor, but she was what the movement needed at the time. She was younger and had learned different skills in her journey with the movement, and those skills were badly needed. Mrs. Catt served as president of the National Woman Suffrage Association for 4 years. She did not succeed in unifying the movement around a plan of action. It would take another dozen years before the need to change became so urgent that Carrie Chapman Catt was drafted to take over. In 1915, she looked around her and saw a crisis in the movement and an opportunity in the political environment. She too had no idea when she issued a call to action to the leaders of the movement that it would turn out to be the winning plan that finally achieved ratification of the federal amendment. She knew she needed to organize and unify the resources of the movement and focus them on a plan of action with a single goal of getting the amendment out of Congress and to the states. She knew she needed strategies adapted to the realities on the ground in the various states, and she needed a commitment from her state leaders to execute the plan. She got that commitment. It was only in retrospect that Maud Wood Park, herself representing the next generation of suffrage leaders, and who would become the first president of the League of Women Voters, dubbed this the winning plan. 2016 is the 100th anniversary of that national convention and that commitment by our suffrage founders to that winning plan. In just 4 years, we will celebrate the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage, and we will celebrate the 100th anniversary of the League of Women Voters. The League is the only living legacy of the fight to get votes for women. Like our predecessors, our mission is defined by our belief that the vote is the symbol of our equality, that gives women the power to create a more perfect democracy. Our work over the generations has been defined by that admonition from Carrie Chapman Catt that the vote must be used and used well. The journey of the League of Women Voters to advance that mission by doing that work is the journey that brings all of us here together today. To continue our journey and to reach our own centennial, we need a plan. And for that plan to be our winning plan, we need the commitment of everyone here to unify around the plan and execute it. Our goal is clear: to make democracy work for everyone and not just for some. Like the suffragists before us, We have been on this journey for some time. Our fight is the fight to protect the vote and reform our elections. The campaign to power the vote in 2012 succeeded in defeating or delaying bad voting laws in 26 of the 31 states that considered or enacted such laws. Many of those laws, however, have now gone into effect because the Supreme Court gutted a key provision of the Voting Rights Act. To ensure that the upcoming presidential election is free, fair, and accessible to every eligible voters, our strategies remain the same. We oppose the laws in the State House, we challenge the laws in the courthouse, and if all else fails, we attack the laws on the ground by getting voters the information they need to cast their ballot. But ensuring that every eligible voter can use that symbol of equality and use it well takes more. Politicians in safe districts may be protected by bad voting laws, but they are also relying on partisan gerrymandering and the influence of dark money. Over the past 2 years, we have worked hard as an organization to increase our understanding of the role of money in politics and to develop an updated consensus around our collective interest in controlling that influence and the First Amendment rights and issues posed by regulation of money in our elections. We have also developed a consensus around criteria for evaluating proposals to amend the Constitution. Additionally, we come to this convention with a proposed concurrence with a redistricting position that is intended not to preempt existing positions, but to give every state the ability to address reform of the redistricting process in the lead up to the 2020 census and the redistricting that must follow. The vote is only a symbol of our equality. We have to use it, and use it well, to make equality itself a reality. Over the past 2 years, we have been reminded over and over again of the suffering inflicted in our democracy by exclusion. We were confronted just this past week with another in a seemingly endless series of tragedies, each worse than the last in terms of loss of life and the expression of hate and fear. The urgency of the need to include every voice, to include everyone in the term "we the people" has never been greater. But our tears and prayers are not enough. Raising our voices in protest is essential, but not enough. Those voices, that protest, has to be heard. And to be heard in American democracy is to be heard in the halls of power. We have to mobilize to stop the abuse of power that has permitted so few to determine the destiny of so many. Looking around this room today, it is hard for us to recall that the vast majority of us were once an excluded group. I was reminded of, in a far more celebratory atmosphere, not celebratory than here, but celebratory certainly than what occurred last week in Orlando, that in too many ways, the vast majority of us are still an excluded group. As women, we are largely excluded from the halls of power where government policy is made. We are even a greater rarity in corporate boardrooms. Our physical safety, our health, and our economic well-being are still largely controlled by those who perceive themselves as more powerful, whether in our communities or in our elected bodies. We have more in common with the excluded than the included. As members of the League of Women Voters, we also have a legacy to draw on and generations of experience to offer. Our challenge is to find a winning plan to engage with those who share our commitment to creating a more perfect democracy. Our campaign for making democracy work is just one part. The celebratory event that I referred to earlier was the White House Summit on the United State of Women, where I was one of 5,000 women and men convened by the White House Council on Women and Girls, amidst a whole host of speakers from many different sectors, including President Obama, Vice President Biden, the First Lady, and the Attorney General. The message that came through to me loud and clear is that as a nation and as women, we must engage with each other in order to embrace change. That change is coming whether we like it or not. And it is more than just a change in demographics of race, ethnicity, and identity. It is a generational change. If the League of Women Voters was founded to finish the fight for suffrage and to finish the fight for equality for women, the generation that has come of age in this century has its own fights to finish. While those in every new generation believe they have all the answers, this generation may come closest to being right. This is a generation raised by women who blazed the way for greater social and economic equality, and who were themselves not far removed from those who fought for the vote. And as many of you know, I am one such woman. My sons came of age in this century. Their mother was not only a professional working outside the home, but also a member of the League of Women Voters. Their grandfather was born before women had the right to vote. And I can assure you, as children, that fact astonished them. Like so many in their generation, they see the world very differently. They truly understand the concept of inclusion. They understand and object to the fact that the privilege they enjoy results just by virtue of having been born white, male, and economically secure. They want to serve. They want to lead. They want a seat at the table, not for themselves, but for what they perceive to be the greater good. As young men, they believe in their power to create a more perfect democracy, and they believe in the power of the other half of the population to do so as well. For my sons and their generation, technology is not a tool. It is an integral part of the way they live their lives. They lead busy lives, busier even than my life was raising them and working and volunteering for the League. They are among the very fortunate in our society. One son is a physician in training, the other is a school teacher in the public school systems in Atlanta. My sons appreciate their good fortune and want others to have the same opportunities they did. My sons understand that it takes more than rhetoric to make that a reality. My sons can have a place in the League of Women Voters. Whether or not they want to find that place depends on our willingness to meet them where they are and our willingness to demonstrate that the League is relevant to the fights they want to finish. We'll be talking about change and engagement a great deal this weekend. Indeed, we've been talking about it a great deal for a very long time. If my children are typical of a new generation, my own journey with the League, in my own journey with the League, I have been the poster child for our need to change and to engage each new generation where they are. I joined the League in 1982 as a young woman just out of law school. I was looking for a volunteer community that met my need for civic engagement as well as the needs of my busy life. I was very fortunate. I found that community in the League, but I also found in the League mentors and friends willing to give me a place at the table and opportunities that fit the demands of my life. Today, I'm at the other end of the spectrum, a recent retiree looking for ways to use my professional skills to support a cause I believe in. Adapting to generational change is not new to the League, but that fact does not make it less challenging, and we must accept that if we are to move forward together, and we must accept that fact if we are to move forward together to engage this new generation. On Tuesday at the White House Summit, I was reminded of perhaps the most celebrated and least understood generational clash of the suffrage movement. President Obama reminded us all that it is nearly 100 years since Alice Paul and her supporters were arrested, picketing the White House for votes for women. We all know that story. It is the central focus of that beloved drama, Iron-Jawed Angels. You may recall that another aspect of that drama is the clash between Alice Paul and Carrie Chapman Catt. The differences between the two women were real, and by 1916, Alice Paul had left the National Women's Suffrage Association and formed her own National Woman's Party. Alice Paul was an American who had joined the suffrage movement while living in England. She had learned the militant tactics of Emma Pankhurst. The movement in Britain was very different than the movement in America for reasons that were more or less obvious. Britain is a parliamentary democracy. The ruling party controls the government. And in the early 20th century, the British press barons were members of the Old Boys Club, which routinely ignored peaceful efforts to draw attention to the cause of votes for women. Here in the United States, at that time, members of Congress owed their allegiance to their constituents more than to their party, and a robust free press and a more rural population then meant that wherever suffrage workers traveled in support of their cause, the local newspaper was eager to cover the event. How many of you know that Carrie Chapman Catt traveled around the world between her terms as president of the National? I have a hand. How many knew that she was in Britain when Emma Pankhurst was arrested for demonstrating for suffrage and staged the first hunger strike? Or that Mrs. Catt was among the cheering supporters who welcomed Mrs. Pankhurst outside Holloway Prison upon her release? Alice Paul brought her English lessons to the National Suffrage Association in 1913. With full support of the leadership, she staged a spectacular parade to coincide with Woodrow Wilson's first inaugural. She was given the leadership of the Congressional Union, the committee of the National that lobbied Congress for the federal amendment. She was a great fundraiser, and she was rankled by the policy of the larger organization of pooling the money she raised and giving her a budget from which to operate. She was impatient with then-President Anna Howard Shaw, who was struggling with a fractious movement divided over strategies with respect to the federal amendment. After the final break came, Alice Paul's Women's Party opposed all presidential candidates in the 1916 election, very much in the British tradition. And she did so regardless of whether or not individual candidates supported suffrage. For Maud Wood Park, her successor on the Congressional Committee of the National, this caused a major setback for the federal amendment. In 1917, while the Silent Sentinels were making headlines, the National Suffrage Association was literally behind the scenes working in Congress and state legislatures to carry out Carrie Catt's winning plan. They were sworn to secrecy with respect to their strategies because Mrs. Catt did not want to alert an organized and well-heeled opposition. Nothing could better illustrate the challenges facing the League today. Militant young activists are starting highly visible movements in support of causes that the League has supported throughout its history. In the meantime, seasoned League activists are working in more traditional ways to influence legislative and regulatory policies in favor of those causes. We are working at the grassroots to register, inform, and turn out voters so that those making these legislative and regulatory decisions reflect the values of those staging the protests. There is still a dispute among historians as to which strategies and tactics were decisive in winning the vote for women. The truth is, it took both. And in August of 1920, despite their differences and their different approaches, both Carrie Chapman Catt and Alice Paul were in Nashville, Tennessee, lobbying legislators to ratify the federal amendment. And we all know that story. It came down to one vote cast by Harry Byrne, who that morning received a letter from his mother, a volunteer. You see why I mentioned my sons. A volunteer with the National Suffrage Association. He changed his vote, and the rest, as they say, is history. Making democracy work for all will take all of us. Together, we have the power to create a more perfect democracy, so long as we always remember that the vote is the symbol of our equality and that we must use it and use it well. I want to thank you for being here. I want to thank you all for your support over the years and for the privilege of allowing me to serve as your president.